All right, we are starting back up for part two of chapter 20. These are the digestive system diseases. And we were just talking about a bunch of acute diarrheal infections. Now, these are going to be diarrheal infections that can still kind of come on pretty quickly. However, we're going to be looking at a different microbe type, at least for these viral diarrheal illnesses. So we have two most common kind of causative agents here, and that is a rotavirus and a norovirus. So, rotavirus is going to be the most common cause of severe diarrhea among children. It's going to potentially result in hospitalization of kids in the United States. It's pretty common in the United States. Unfortunately, the incubation period is approximately 2 days, and that transmission is going to be a fecal oral route where the individual comes into contact with contaminated food and water, but we can also have indirect contact with fomites that have that virus on them, and then maybe the kid touches a toy or something and then puts their hand in their mouth or puts the toy in their mouth or something like that. Prevention, there is a vaccine. Symptoms, it's again very common in kids, but it's most dangerous for infants, where it's going to cause diarrhea, fever, vomiting, potentially dehydration that can lead to shock. Um, Norovirus is going to be the second most common uh, viral diarrheal illness when it comes to these particular types of illnesses. The transmission is fecal oral route transmission through contaminated water or food. Symptoms is a ton of diarrhea for 3 to 5 days, which is way too long to be having diarrhea, as well as potentially absolutely projectile vomiting, and then a mild fever. However, the big symptoms of a norovirus is going to be nonstop diarrhea and projectile vomiting, like demon possession style, essentially. You may recognize this term norovirus from a handful of cases that recently, as far as spring 2025 goes, there was a norovirus that was spreading for quite a while, causing these symptoms. But where we see noroviruses more commonly is going to be on like cruise ships where people are in dense areas and potentially things get contaminated, and not a good time if you're having diarrhea and vomiting on a cruise ship. That's a terrible way to spend your vacation. But the big thing here for both of these infections is that we want to stay hydrated. Again, if your immune system is compromised, these viruses can be particularly deadly. However, if you're relatively healthy and then you contract the virus, the biggest thing is we don't want you to become dehydrated. So now we are moving into what is considered kind of like true food poisoning, even though the last couple of illnesses you can get from contaminated food, but this is going to be kind of that classic food poisoning, what we more often see and most commonly see as far as microbes go and the type of foods that they contaminate. So this is going to be a little bit different than what we were just talking about. Those were specific illnesses. This is kind of like a broad spectrum food poisoning, what causes it, and what are the symptoms, all that good stuff. So for food poisoning, this is still going to be typically a pretty sudden, so it is acute diarrheal infection, like very quick actually. So symptoms will include nausea, frequent vomiting, diarrhea, usually following a meal, pretty soon after you consume that meal, that lasts maybe up to 6 hours. Um, Now that's kind of the important thing is it's very sudden it comes on, but it doesn't last for forever. If it lasts for longer than 6 hours, it's probably one of those other diarrheal illnesses and not this true, if you want to think of it that way, food poisoning. Um, so the symptoms are caused because of preformed toxins, and it's usually the toxins from these three bacteria that cause all of those symptoms. So these are the three biggest offenders, most common microbes, most common bacteria that cause food poisoning. Make sure you know them. Make sure you know which bacteria are going to be associated with specifically this title of an illness as food poisoning. So usually we see again very fast symptoms, but it's because of the toxins that these bacteria, the bacterial cells produce. So instead of an infection like we saw before, we see intoxication because it is the toxin itself that is causing the problem, not necessarily the microbe itself. All right, so a little bit about each of those microbes, and there are two things I want you to memorize from this slide when it comes to true food poisoning, and that is the microbe name and the food that we find it in. So our first one is Staphylococcus aureus. And again, it is not necessarily the microbe that's the problem, it's the toxin that is being consumed that is the issue, right? So these toxins from S. aureus are usually found in things like creams. So if it's a custard or a sauce or a cream pastry, sometimes we see it in processed meat or chicken salad, but again, we're kind of seeing that with like a cream of some kind, maybe unrefrigerated or contaminated ham. Just kind of depends. But what I want you to associate with S. aureus is mainly cream or creams that are contaminated with the toxin produced by S. aureus. Now we have Bacillus cereus. That again, we are looking at the toxin that is produced by this particular microbe, but where we find this situation is usually on vegetables that haven't been cleaned properly. So they're still contaminated, maybe by soil. A lot of times we see this associated with maybe fried rice, like buffet style fried rice, not to scare you away from like going to your local Chinese buffet and getting loaded up on carbs, but you know, choose your battles. There are two toxins, one that is associated primarily with diarrhea. The other one is going to be more associated with vomiting. And that depends on either meat or veggies for diarrhea, and the fried rice is going to be primarily for vomiting. And then we have Clostridium perfringens. Perfringens? I like that better. That sounds nicer. And this is associated with usually animal flesh and veggies, like beans that just haven't been thoroughly cooked. And it is contaminated with the toxin produced by that particular microbe. Okay, everything up till now in our notes has essentially been acute diarrheal infections, and now we're moving into a new category of chronic diarrhea infections. Very briefly, and then we'll move on to a couple of other fun stuff. And I've got pictures, and I'm sorry, maybe. At least I didn't show you pictures for these last couple of diseases. So, you're welcome. There you go. So chronic diarrheal infections are any diarrheal infection that lasts longer than 14 days. Because for the most part, what we see in the acute diarrheal infections is they come on usually pretty suddenly, and then they also kind of go away pretty quickly too. So these are usually infections that last a lot longer. It takes a little longer for them to develop. So The infectious chronic diarrheal infections include maybe this type of E. coli, maybe a couple of these different protozoans. Non-infectious might be conditions like irritable bowel syndrome or IBS or ulcerative colitis, also sometimes just called UC. So remember that with the infectious, what we're saying is that they can be passed on, right? Versus non-infectious, that's like a condition, right? So potentially associated with microbes. We'll see. I do not need you to memorize this chart. It just has a lot of nice information about those four different microbes, the bacteria and different protozoans that cause chronic diarrheal infections. Most of them are a fecal oral transmission. Prevention is typically just cleanliness, good hygiene, good food cooking practices, various different kinds of treatment, usually in anti-protozoan for those protozoan infections. Unfortunately for the E. coli, there is no treatment. And then there's a handful of symptoms listed out there, but you do not need to memorize all of these things for these four different types. I would maybe just know the transmission, and then what they are, the name of them, and that they are a chronic diarrhea infection instead of acute. Boy, howdy, I should have given you a little bit of a warning there. So we are moving away from diarrheal infections and going on to dental caries, which is essentially just to say diseases that can cause tooth rot, is basically all we're looking at here. So the microbe type is a bacteria. The causative agent is usually Streptococcus mutans, but instead of just one kind of offender, this is usually a polymicrobial infection, so multiple microbes, but this is going to be our primary player in this situation. The reservoir is humans. Transmission is endogenous. It is part of our home team that kind of goes a little buck wild, and kind of gets carried away potentially if we are not taking care of our teeth or going to the dentist very much. So it is the most common infectious disease in humans. Fun fact. So the big symptom that we're going to see is essentially that plaque forms over the tooth, and when it does, essentially bacteria kind of gets stuck up against the teeth, and in the process of fermentation, the byproduct of some type of acid is going to be produced from that bacteria, and that eats away at that outer protective layer of our teeth called enamel. And kind of a little PSA here, if that enamel is gone, it's not coming back. You can't rebuild your enamel. Kind of one of the big differences between teeth and bones, aside from the presence or absence of collagen, which collagen is found in our bones, but not in our teeth, as well as there's enamel and dentine when it comes to our teeth and not in our bones. A big difference between teeth and bones, aside from the three that I mentioned, is teeth don't heal. Once they are damaged or broken, or the enamel or the dentine is rotted away, it's gone. It cannot come back. Your teeth do not heal themselves. Your gums can, potentially, but your actual tooth will not heal itself. Bones can heal themselves. Teeth do not. So once you have a situation like what we're seeing on the screen here, that's it. You need that little bit of tooth, if it's left, pulled out, and potentially a fake tooth put in its place, if that's what you want. Should be a little bit no mystery here as to how to prevent dental caries, or cavities, right? And that's good oral hygiene. And I know it is easier said than done, but brushing and flossing twice a day is very good to prevent plaque buildup. Also making sure that you go see your dentist once a year is the recommendation. But minimum, make sure you're brushing, flossing. If you like to drink sugary drinks, whether that is soda or juice or maybe energy drinks, or I don't know what you do with your life, whatever. A good rule of thumb is once you are finished consuming that sugary drink, go ahead and get some water and just do a little swish in your mouth and then swallow. One, it's good to drink water. Two, it gets that sugar off of your teeth. So kind of good rule of thumb. So treatment is anti-cavity mouthwash that contains fluoride, using twice a day when you see early signs of tooth damage. But more likely you're going to have to get teeth removed or some type of fillings or all that fun stuff with your dentist. So we can see the progression of the decay from bacteria kind of causing these disruptions in the enamel of the tooth. If you are familiar with tooth anatomy, the enamel is that hard protective outside. The dentin is on the inside. It's kind of a living layer of quote unquote bone, but it's not bone, guys. Very important to note that teeth are not bones, but it's like a living layer, that dentin. And once that enamel has been eaten away by the bacteria or sugar or whatever, it's a combination of both technically, then essentially it's burrowing into your tooth. And once it gets into that dentin and past that dentin, there is a hollow area within your tooth called the pulp cavity. And this contains quote unquote pulp. Now, what is pulp when it comes to your tooth? It is your nerve endings, blood vessels. It's kind of a soft, squishy inside, if you want to think of that way, if the dentin and the enamel are kind of a harder outer coating. Now, if that infection gets deep enough that it gets to that pulp cavity, you are going to be in so much pain, guys, because that's where your nerve endings are. Probably once it gets to the dentin, you're probably going to be feeling it, but if it gets to that pulp cavity, then you're definitely going to need surgery, potentially get that tooth removed, because it's probably past the point of being filled or capped or anything like that. Now, another area that can kind of be affected by an infection in the mouth is going to be your gums. So we have gingivitis, which is just an inflammation of your gums from bacteria acting up, and then periodontitis, which is going to cause the gums to pull away from the teeth. And if it becomes so extreme, then your teeth can fall out. So this is usually from a buildup of plaque around your teeth that is causing this inflammation of the gums. And so the gums are like, don't touch me. I don't want that. That doesn't feel good. And so they start to retract and pull away from your teeth. And, as you can see with the progression of this image, once the gums reach a certain point, your teeth will just kind of fall out of your mouth. So these are two different kinds of diseases still caused by bacteria. Good way to prevent it is going to be good hygiene. And here is a lovely picture of kind of some normal to mild to moderate inflammation of the gums. And then we have a little bit more severe pulling away, as well as quite a bit of that infection along the teeth, probably caused from plaque going on there. So the gums are pulling away from the teeth. You see a lot more exposed. It almost looks like the teeth are really long, or this person has really big teeth, but it just has to do with the fact that their gums are inflamed and pulling away from their teeth. And then we also have those infections eating away at the enamel as well. That takes us into our next disease, and we're kind of going now, instead of looking at diarrheal infections, we're now looking at infections of the various parts of the digestive system that kind of focus in on one feature, but may cause other problems with other areas in our body, but primarily it's affecting one thing as far as this infection goes. So that naturally moves us into mumps, because we're still kind of up in the face, up in the mouth area as far as diseases that we're talking about. And mumps, fun fact, is a virus. It is going to be in a human reservoir. Transmission is respiratory droplets. The signs and symptoms usually start in the upper respiratory tract and then become a blood infection. But the big symptom that you can look for is this asymptomatic swelling of the salivary glands in the neck and jaw. So when I show you a picture next of individuals that have the mumps, you're going to look at that and be like, oh, yeah, totally know what that is. So we can see complications with those blood infections, and it causes the virus to get into other organs, but that primary symptom that we typically see is going to be that swelling of the salivary glands in the face. However, again, it is usually asymptomatic, so one side of the face will really swell, and then the other side will be unaffected typically. The prevention is the MMR or MMRV vaccine, just, whichever one you want. If you want to include varicella and have that prevention of chickenpox, that is also included, or just the MMR. When it comes to treatment, you just got to let it ride itself out, because it is a virus. There's nothing we can do. Just make yourself comfortable and, take pictures, because, it's kind of an interesting symptom as far as how it displays asymmetrically. And here are those pictures of the mumps. We do have that asymmetrical swelling. You can see it really well on that young person's face in the upper right corner, where that large mump essentially is causing that swelling of the salivary glands. But yeah, that is the symptom we typically look for. Moving into gastritis and gastric ulcers, initially it was thought that gastric ulcers were caused by eating spicy foods. And while eating foods with a lot of spice probably doesn't help with ulcers, it is not the root cause. The root cause is actually a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, and we normally have this bacteria in our stomachs. So this is a normal home team player that is normally inside of us at any given point in time. The transmission of gastritis is usually respiratory droplets, saliva, or fecal oral transmission. Now, what happens is what goes on in our stomach. Just to give you an idea, let me back for just like a second. So in your stomach, this is kind of a receptacle for food after you swallow, right? So if you're like eating a sandwich or something, you're chewing it up, using mechanical digestion, and that's going to make its way down into your stomach. Your stomach is going to do two types of digestion, mechanical and chemical. So mechanical in that it's going to be still kind of crushing food up, and there's like little creases inside of the stomach that will allow for this to happen too. However, there is also stomach acid inside of our stomach as well to perform chemical digestion. Now, what happens is this little microbe is going to essentially kind of get into the lining, the mucosal lining of the stomach, and it neutralizes the stomach acid, which is going to cause a couple of chemical reactions, which end up breaking down the lining of the stomach. Now, the lining of our stomachs is usually, I wouldn't say it's substantially stronger than any other lining of any organ, but I mean, keep in mind, it's constantly being washed over by stomach acid, which has a pH of 2, which means that our stomach acid, given enough time, can eat through metal. So it's a very strong acid inside of our stomachs to break down food. Now, if this little microbe causes this issue with the lining of our stomach, then what we see is our stomach acid start to eat away at the cells lining our stomach, which causes an open sore. And because our pH of our stomach acid is so low, so acidic, it's going to continue to make that sore inflamed and potentially get worse. This is called an ulcer when we have a sore inside of the digestive tract. So it's kind of a problem that keeps kind of expounding on itself over and over. And unless you take something, kind of think like Tums, if you want to think of it that way, the way Tums works is it is going to raise your pH so that it is further away from 2, maybe gets it to a 4, maybe a 5, something like that. But it is making your stomach less acidic. And there are medications that you can take for gastric ulcers and gastritis in order to get the pH of your stomach to a point that you are not constantly washing an open sore with acid. So we're changing the pH of the stomach so that our ulcers can heal. I did kind of get ahead of myself there, but I could go on and on about gastric ulcers. I had one when I was in my mid-20s, and it was awful, well and truly. And things like stress make them substantially worse. So anything that's going to kind of tank your immune system, it opens up kind of a door for these microbes to see an opportunity, and then they start running amok. So for signs and symptoms, gastritis, we see stomach inflammation, and then we see these peptic ulcers, these ulcers forming inside of the stomach. We can also see this potentially leading to stomach cancer because we are causing so much damage to those cells that they're constantly having to replace themselves, and that can potentially turn into our DNA in our cells becoming mutated, and thus developing stomach cancer can be kind of a big issue there. Prevention is just good hygiene, as well as, you know, if you start to see that you're, I don't know, having a lot of acid reflux and issues with your tummy, probably a good sign to try and talk to your doctor. Another symptom it's not listed is potentially seeing black feces, essentially, and that just means that there is blood in your poop that was from higher up in your digestive tract, and potentially a lot of blood, depending on the ulcer itself. If there is a brighter blood, that means there is an ulcer or a cut or something closer to your anus. But if it is black feces, typically that means that it is some type of ulcer higher up in the digestive tract. Treatment is going to be antibiotics, Pepto-Bismol, Tums, things like that. That's a short-term solution, but usually it's something to help the pH of your stomach acid be less acidic so that your lining of your stomach can heal. Here's some images of some ulcers in the stomach, on the stomach, as well as kind of another concern that can happen is that these ulcers get so bad that we get a perforated stomach or a perforated ulcer, meaning that not dissimilar to a perforated bowel, but essentially we open the stomach up into the abdominal cavity, which would be absolutely not a good thing because, again, our stomach acid is so strong. We don't really want that in the abdominal cavity. We would like to keep that in the stomach. All right. We are finally on to gastrointestinal anthrax. This is where that same bacteria, Bacillus anthracis, that comes from soil, gets into our system. Remember that there are 3 different ways that anthrax can get into us, either by a cut, or we can inhale it, or this last one, you can ingest it. So this is finally that last one we get to talk about, and that is that ingested anthrax. So prevention, same as it has always been, and that is a vaccine. Treatment, antibiotics. The only exception is unless you've inhaled it, there's nothing we can do. This slide is genuinely no different than what we saw in chapter 19 with the respiratory infections. We talked about cutaneous anthrax having a 20% mortality rate, getting into our body through a cut of some kind. Gastrointestinal anthrax, which is the one we're talking about right now, is consuming contaminated or undercooked food. There is a 50-50 chance you could survive if you consume anthrax and get treatment. And then that last one that we talked in the last chapter is anthrax that has been inhaled. And that has a 100% mortality rate. Unfortunately, there is nothing we can do if you have inhaled anthrax. So when it comes to anthrax in general, it's usually just dependent on how you have gotten the anthrax into your system, but all of them typically can lead to septicemia. For specifically this ingested anthrax, we see nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, sometimes it's bloody, painful swallowing, abdominal pain, and potentially leading to shock. Okay, moving on to a virus that affects the liver specifically, one that I'm sure you've probably heard of, and that is hepatitis. There are different strains of this virus, hepatitis A, B, and C. There are more, but we're just going to look at these 3 for now. Well, not even for now, for this class. That's it. Just these 3. So, when it comes to these 3, they are the most common causes of hepatitis. The signs and symptoms is cirrhosis of the liver, which just means inflammation of that particular organ. It's going to cause jaundice because if the liver becomes inflamed, it can't perform its normal functions, which is usually to filter our blood and then to kind of dump that product of filtering blood into the gallbladder to then be eliminated in our feces, because it all dumps into the small intestine anyway. Now, if the liver cannot perform its functions, it's going to have a buildup of bile and bilirubin, all this good stuff that should go away, but it doesn't. And what this causes is this symptom called jaundice that is a yellowing of the skin and eyes. It's a little bit easier to see jaundice on mucous membranes like the eyes, which should be white, right? That's the sclera of the eye. So if the liver can't do its job, we start to see these symptoms of essentially it not performing properly. All right, so this is that symptom, that jaundice. Again, you can see it pretty well on the sclera of the eye, that yellowing of the eye. We can also see a little bit of a tint of that yellow around the eyes on the skin. Now, this is that cirrhosis of the liver. So it ends up making what's supposed to be a healthy liver, which is what we see on the left, really nice, really pretty looking gland, turn into something that kind of looks horribly diseased after, this virus essentially just ravages the liver. So particularly bad, you get these large, almost kind of boil-like bubbling projections. And I do believe that has to do with the inability of the liver to process the various things that it needs to process. But you don't have to know that. Just know that we go from a very beautiful, healthy-looking liver to something that looks like it's coming out of a sci-fi movie, essentially, when it comes to cirrhosis. Now, I do have these 3 strains of hepatitis up here. I do want you to know the names of the 3 strains. We just talked about them. They're A, B, and C. I hope that's not too hard to remember, guys. But I also want you to know 2 features about each strain of hepatitis, and that is that the mode of transmission, which for hepatitis A is fecal oral or vehicle. For hepatitis B, this is going to be through blood contact, direct contact, possibly sexual contact, and vertical transmission. And for hepatitis C, this is through blood contact as well as vertical transmission. The other thing I want you to know for each one of these strains is the prevention. So there are vaccines for hepatitis A and B. There is not one for C. So make sure you know that. So the 2 things I want you to know for each strain of hepatitis, the mode of transmission and prevention, if there is one. Guys, I feel like I've waited the whole semester to talk to you about helminth infections. And honestly, I'm so sorry for the pictures, but like, you should see these things. They're pretty crazy. So remember that a helminth is going to be parasitic worms. And of course, they'd come up in the digestive system because that's where they exist typically. However, there are some horrifying ways that parasitic worms can get into our system. We'll talk about it. But for the most part, it's going to be fecal oral routes, or the horrifying one, the nightmare fuel, is penetration of the skin. We'll talk about it. I'll show you pictures. You're going to hate everything. And you're never going to walk around barefoot outside ever again. So when it comes to the prevention of helminth infections, there are no vaccines, but there are prophylactics in areas that may be more prone to having these types of infections occur. You can think of things like heartworm medication for your pets. That's kind of an example of a prophylactic here. So treatment is going to be anti-helminthic drugs or possibly surgery, depending on how big the worm gets. So if you can't take a medicine that is going to essentially flush all the wormies and their eggs out of your digestive tract, you are going to have violent diarrhea for a good little bit of time, because that is the best way to get rid of a helminth infection, is to just flush the entire digestive tract out. If that doesn't work, or it potentially wouldn't work, then the best route is you gotta go in manually and remove the worm. Think about that. Think about that for just a second. There's been a handful of like ER, Grey's Anatomy. I think there was a episode of House where they look at these really crazy helminth infections, and I mean, they're horror stories, but there's always a nugget of truth in everything, so they probably heard that from somewhere and then wrote an episode about it. I'll be real. Terrifying stuff. All right, all right, all right. So, the title, in my opinion, of these next two slides is a little bit of a misnomer. Um, it's more so there are different transmission options as far as a helminth can go, and it has to do with the life cycle of the helminth itself. So that's where that term, helminth life cycle. But really what we're looking at, and what I want you to focus on, is that there are 4 transmission options when it comes to helminths, and it does have to do with their life cycle. I don't really care if you know what the life cycle is. It might be good to understand it just a tiny bit. But the big thing here is, let's go through these transmission options. How can this worm get into you and make you sick? Now, option A is going to be a fecal oral route. That means you are consuming potentially poo-poo, and that poo has eggs in it, or the worms itself, and it gets into your system because you consume something, and then they get out by you pooping, because they're in your digestive tract reproducing. So fun stuff. That is option A. Option B is going to be that the worm burrows through the host to get to the digestive tract. Let's talk about that for just a second. So you've got this worm living in the environment, and you go walking about barefoot because, bless you, you love the earth and you want to feel the grass underneath your feet, or the sand, or the rocks, or whatever. Live your life. I love that for you. Except you walk on a worm and it says opportunities. And so it burrows into your foot, under your skin, and then it starts to make its way up your leg, under your skin, to your digestive tract, where it will then reproduce, produce eggs. You will defecate those eggs out, and then they're back in the environment. And then the adults, or the larvae, or whatever they are, doesn't really matter, go find another host to burrow under their skin and get into their digestive tract. Absolutely nightmare fuel, in my opinion. Option C. So this is the third option of transmission based on a helminth life cycle, is going to be that some other host, maybe something like a cow, has the eggs get into the cow's muscle tissue, and that infected tissue is then consumed by a human, so the second host. Now, once the human has consumed that contaminated tissue that contains the eggs of this particular helminth, this worm, then once in our digestive tract, the larvae are released, and then the adults come out, reproduce, eggs get back into the environment, cow eats, grass that's contaminated with human waste for whatever reason, and then the cycle continues. But essentially, this is different than a fecal oral route because there is no consumption of feces for the human host. Might be for the cow, I don't know. But when it comes to humans, that is the one we care about. How does the worm get into us? And that is through contaminated meat. Now, for option D, this is where the worm has options. Now, it's not a one or the other, like it's not B or D, but it could be both. It could be one or the other. So option D is where the worm itself has options. Whereas when we looked at options B and C, where with B, it is the worm burrowing through the skin, and C, where the host consumes contaminated meat, it was one or the other. But for this one, the worm has options. It could do either option, essentially, which horrifying to think about. Okay, so a little bit more about our wormy little friends. I do want you to know the common name of these four different little worms. So we have pinworms, whipworms, fish tapeworms, and then dwarf or rat tapeworms is the last one. So we have four different worms I want you to know. I want you to know the name and then their life cycle transmission. So for pinworms, this is going to be the most common helminth infection, and it is going to be option A, I believe. Yes, yeah, option A. So whipworm is going to have a whip-like or stringy tail, and they also have hooks or barbs to latch into our intestines so that we can't dislodge them very easily. They are also that option A as far as transmission. The third is going to be the fish tapeworm. These guys get really big, is kind of a difference between these last two. Their option is C for transmission. And then we have the dwarf rat tapeworm. And these are substantially smaller but very similar to the fish tapeworm. It's just they're tinier. And that is also option C. Let's talk about pinworms for a second. So pinworms are going to be a very common helminth infection, especially in young children. It has everything to do with the fact that kids have no, bless them, decorum when it comes to being uncomfortable, as well as they put everything in their mouth. So those two features of children make it very easy for pinworms to be passed around like a daycare or a kindergarten or younger elementary grades. So what we see happen is the adult female pinworm will poke her little head out of the anus, and this is going to make the skin around the anus irritated and itch like crazy. So the thing that female pinworm is doing is laying eggs on the outside of the anus, because that is what they do, and it makes sense when we talk about why. So let's say a little kid has pinworms. That female pinworm is causing irritation. What does a kid do? Because again, bless them, kids don't necessarily have a whole lot of decorum. They scratch. And when they scratch their little tushies, they are getting pinworm eggs lodged underneath their fingernails or on their fingers. And then what do kids do? They touch everything. And then what do other kids do? They touch those things and then they put them in their mouth or they put their fingers in their mouth. Now, if that happens, those eggs are now inside of that other child. And that is how easy pinworms can spread. And this is what they look like, kind of like itty bitty little wisps, if you will. Another way to kind of identify them if you have kids or if you think a kid has pinworms is there used to be this kind of way to like put a little piece of tape over their anus at night, and typically the female pinworm will come out at night and plant her eggs around the anus, and you can kind of catch her, if you will, in the tape, because they'll get stuck in the tape. Another thing is just like when you wipe a little kid after they go to the bathroom, you know, the worms are alive, so you would be able to identify them pretty easily if you're looking in a diaper or if you wipe a child, essentially that they're going to be moving, wiggling little worms in the feces. Super fun. This is why I said no snacks for these lectures. I promise I don't have a whole lot of stories about these whipworms and tapeworms other than the whipworms look disgusting. I hate them, but I hate tapeworms more because the young lady there with the red mat with what looks like multiple worms is segmenting together one worm. Let that sink in for just like a second. That is how long that tapeworm is in that beaker that we can see too. That is not multiple worms. That is one worm. And remember that when it comes to tapeworms, they are segmented. So those segments contain eggs. So they break apart. That's their purpose. They can do that. That's a neat feature for them. They can break apart and let their eggs go and still be perfectly fine and alive. These things get huge. They can be really long. I'll be real with you. I used to know the record for the longest tapeworm in humans, and I don't remember that information anymore, but I know it was crazy long, and it had to be removed surgically, because you can see how big they get, how long they can get. That thing's got to come out through surgery, because you don't want it to break apart. All right, we've got 3 more helminth species that I want you to know. These guys are going to be kind of the other side of the symptoms that we are going to see with these helminth diseases, because we talked about tapeworms and whipworms and pinworms, but there was one specific kind of worm we didn't talk about, and we've definitely mentioned them before, and that is roundworms. So we have 2 species of roundworm, intestinal roundworms, and then this other one called, Toxocara. And then we also have hookworms. So I still want you to know the species of worm and then their common mode of transmission based on their life cycle. So for this Toxocara roundworm species, this is going to be that life cycle A. For the other roundworm, the intestinal roundworms, that is also life cycle A. So for these guys, typically they're going to be found in the intestines. The problem with the Toxocara one is it's going to leave the intestines by eating its way to other areas of your body, like your fingers and your eyes. Yes, that is what you heard. They will move to fingers and eyes, and the next image I have on the next slide is honestly my least favorite thing to ever look at, and we will very briefly be on that slide. So, prepare yourself emotionally, I think. That second roundworm, again, still in the intestines mostly. They grow thick and very quickly. And the problem is because they stay in the intestines, reproducing like mad, they fill up the intestines until the intestines burst. Ugh. From there, they move everywhere else, wherever they can get their little gross bodies to go. So once they make your intestines pop like a balloon, then they're going to move to other places. Now, our last one, this hookworm, is that transmission style that I hate the most. This is going to be that life cycle B where they burrow into your like foot or your skin and then make their way to your intestines. So let's look at some pictures and very briefly look at the pictures. Ugh, I hate this one so much, especially the eye. But this is that roundworm Toxocara species and its migratory symptoms, where it is moving from your intestines to other places like your fingers or your eyes. Did you have a good look? Fantastic. Moving on. Still moving quickly because yuck. We have intestinal roundworms again. They fill the intestines so fully that they cause the intestines to burst open. Horrifying. And then, of course, we have hookworms, which are going to burrow into the feet. And you can see that little nastiness moving its way up the foot until it moves up your leg and into your intestines. That is his life goal, is to move from your feet to your tummy, is essentially what's happening. So, fun stuff. Hope you loved it. Fantastic. Now, there are two specific helminth infections that I want you to know that have a specific name. It's not just it's pinworms or it's tapeworms or whatever. There are only two specific helminth infections that I want you to know. So here they are. This is cysticercosis. Cysticercosis. Sure. You know, I'm not going to ask you to say it properly on the test, I promise. As long as you can spell it and you can see it and read it, we're good. The microbe type is a tapeworm. It's called Tania solium. So specifically, this microbe type is brand new to our diseases. This is a helminth type of microbe. The reservoir is humans and pigs. The transmission style is that life cycle C, and humans get infected by eating animal flesh that is contaminated with this tapeworm, the eggs of the tapeworm specifically, and then the larvae then reproduce in our intestines, and then we defecate them out. Sorry, should have given you a warning on the picture. What we see is the symptoms usually include liver swelling as well as malfunctions of the liver. Sometimes the worms can move to different places as far as our body goes, so they can cause issues with the brain that can lead to seizures. Prevention is usually just good hygiene, food safe practices, consuming clean water. Treatment is usually anti-helminthic drugs or surgery. However, this condition usually gets misdiagnosed because it is one of those neglected parasitic infections in the US. So most US doctors would not see the symptoms and potentially think, oh, it's this type of tapeworm. So it does get misdiagnosed pretty frequently. And here we got some lovely images of this worm moving to the brain, in the liver as well. And we can also see how big they can get, which is pretty nasty. And they do have hooks. They have suckers because they are, again, a type of tapeworm, but they need a way to latch on and kind of hold firm to us, because our body's going to try and get rid of them. All right, moving on to the last specific infection caused by helminths. This is going to be caused by a blood fluke, and if that name doesn't heebie or jeebies, then, I don't know what will at this point, guys. But the causative agent is those two species of blood fluke. I'm not going to try to attempt it. You can read it, you can write it down. I believe in you. But these guys are going to cause schistosomiasis, which is going to lead to liver disease. So the reservoir is in humans and snails. The transmission is life cycle D, meaning that it could be, they kind of have options. They could use life cycle B or C. So that is what happens. So humans will get infected by the parasite, potentially burrowing through intact skin in areas that have this particular type of blood fluke. And from there, it can also get into your system if you pee or poo in water that is contaminated. They can get into you through those orifices. So yeah, fun stuff. Cute. We love it. Some signs and symptoms that we see with schistosomiasis is hepatomegaly, which is going to be an enlargement of the liver, leading to liver disease, splenomegaly, which is a spleen becoming enlarged, and if the worms get into our central nervous system or our heart, they can cause essentially an immune inflammatory response. So, super fun. We love it. Great. Fun times. I've got some interesting images for you on the next slide, so give us a second. Prevention is going to be clean drinking water, as well as clean water for bathing, washing clothes, as well as fishing, making sure you're not fishing in contaminated bodies of water. And then the treatment is going to be this particular type of helminthicide, essentially, and it kills the worms. Okay, so we've got a couple images of this schistosomiasis, where we can see the granulomatose, which is going to be that enlarging of various areas, which is essentially just inflammation, as well as potentially the enlarging of maybe a liver or a spleen, causing that protrusion in those individuals. So not a fun time, pretty nasty little fella. With that, my friends, that is the end of diseases of the GI tract. If you want to use this chart, be my guest. It's a nice way to kind of summarize everything that we were talking about. Other than that, make sure you are studying. Again, flashcards are going to be your best friend when it comes to all this memorization, using the kind of like quick study guide material to summarize everything we've talked about that is on Brightspace that I've provided for you. Again, I would kind of keep doing that. You guys have been doing really good with these last couple units. So just kind of keep at it. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to message me, email me. Happy to talk about this. Just let me know what I can do to help you guys out in these last couple of units, or last couple of chapters with this last unit. So happy studying, make good choices.